Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm Finlo Costain, editor of 8.9.com. Of course, venture capitalists need to be able to spot a good investment, but to do that successfully, they need to have a remarkable understanding of the market in which they operate and the ability to develop strong relationships with the people behind the companies they invest in. Christopher Ramsay and Simon Evill are the brains behind Pelican Ag, a venture capital company right at the heart of the regenerative agriculture movement. And there are few people with a greater capacity to provide insight into the key themes and trends that are shaping the next phase of market growth. Christopher and Simon are with me today. Christopher, what are the biggest topics right now? What are Regen Ag investors talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Finlo. Thanks for having us. Honoured to be here, as always. We're having a moment in the sun here, and regenerative agriculture, regenerative food systems, regenerative health, regenerative soil, regenerative ecosystems. These are all fairly conceptual ideas that can be hard to get our heads around. But what's interesting is what's actually happening on the ground across that farm to fork value chain. And there are totally disruptive bits of science or bits of policy or bits of cultural movements which are now becoming mainstream. The groundswell is now becoming significant. And an example of that would be in America at the moment, like or dislike Robert Kennedy, but by employing people like Casey Means to be Secretary General, where she is now focusing on food as medicine, holistic lifestyle as medicine over instantly prescribing pharmaceuticals, is an enormous piece. It's just a piece of the pie that is forcing a holistic approach to how we view the overall food and health system. So in terms of our excitement at the moment, we've got over 800 companies trying to solve for increasing the health of our soils through to improving the ability for our supply chains to actually exist while maintaining the nutritional quality of these foodstuffs and improve the ecosystems around them, right through to trying to educate and inform a consumer, work with a corporate to allow their supply chains to transition in a way that's ethical and cost effective. And ultimately, all of that is playing into an awareness piece that means Jeremy Clarkson can talk about it in Clarkson's Farm, or Chris Van Tulleken can become a best-selling author with ultra-processed people, or that Common Ground, the Hollywood film that had some fantastic backing and is the sequel to Kiss the Ground, which is on Amazon and definitely worth a watch if your audience haven't already seen it. But for films like that to become Amazon and Netflix mainstays because the demand is there is very encouraging. And within this whole world of sustainable food and farming, shifts such as bringing a younger audience in, bringing a younger farming community in, understanding how to produce this information such that it can be consumed by the various different geographies and actors within this farm to fork and nature restoration supply chain is the piece that is humming with entrepreneurial talent at the moment. And so Simon and I, having the privilege to pick 20 to 30 founders who are already beginning to transition bits of that supply chain into being regenerative, to trying to hold water on the landscape, to trying to create efficiencies in supply chain and ultimately a healthy human being. It feels like an absolute privilege at this moment in time. And we can't believe there aren't more investors crowding into this space to own it in a way that I suppose we would like to over the course of the next few years.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Chris. And you mentioned Common Ground there, and that's actually available now on Amazon Prime as well, not just Kiss the Ground, and it's, as you say, it's a great watch. Now, Simon, where do you think the biggest investment opportunities lie in the next 12 months?
I mean, this is going to sound self-serving, and it is, but I think the biggest investment opportunity is in managers such as ourselves investing in a regenerative food system, and not just venture, but across the whole spectrum. our space is dripping with talent. Chris had a dinner last night with a bunch of other emerging fund managers in the space. We've been to all of the big conferences where we meet people focused on these themes. All of these people are going to be building portfolios of underlying companies which have alighted on regeneration in different areas of the economy, in different areas of food and farming and textiles and forestry, etc. And all of these opportunities represent a renaissance moment. They're not just an opportunity for incremental improvements in how land is managed or how food is produced or how carbon is sequestered or how water cycles are improved within the landscape. These are huge, dramatic shifts in how human beings operate and manage land for the betterment of future generations and for all creatures on this planet. I think that's the biggest investment opportunity. Of course, the underlying companies that we look at are absolutely fascinating, and the people running those companies are much more interesting than Chris and I when you get a chance to speak to them in terms of what they're focusing on. So that would be my two pennies worth.
Now, Christopher, I want to ask you about the role of technology, which for regen farmers themselves, I think can often be seen as an expensive distraction rather than an enabler. So I wonder if you could talk us through what makes tech special and worth the attention of investors and farmers. You're on mute, Chris.
Apologies. It's a great question, and
just to pause because you've come back in. So, what makes it worth the attention of investors and farmers?
It's a great question, and it's a question that we're keen to give an answer that lands with any future investors or anyone looking at this space. In that technology has traditionally always been an enabler of large-scale revolutions or renaissances, in that whether it was the plow or whether it was the loom or whether it was the silicon chip, it can fast forward adoption of practices that ultimately Simon and I want to be better for planet and people, but also have to be more efficable and cheaper. And so the beauty here is that if we take a generalist approach and paint tech as something to be wary of, and we're both fully aware that farmers have been sold to incorrectly for centuries, and their appetite for risk is low. But if we look at some of the technologies that we're backing that are working with farmers at the moment, it might be a tech platform that provides access to information as to how to farm, which is cheaper and more efficable. So there might be suspicion to begin with, but actually they're going to be saving time and money, and they can check that with their peers. Or it might be, one of our investments was a company called No Fence, which is virtual fencing. And we've had users of that tell the No Fence team that they've managed to take their wife out on a date for the first time in 10 years because it saved so much time. So I suppose there's natural concern around the word technology, and part of that in terms of a business model, looking at it from an investment prism, is we are generally speaking not trying to back companies that are selling direct to farmers because of those inherent issues. So Mad Capital was born out of a network of regenerative farmers that they eventually grew to being in every state in America where people could share best practice. Mad Capital became a lending platform that provided preferential rates to whatever needs a farmer transitioning to regenerative might require. If we look at something like FA Bio, that is a fungal microbe discovery platform looking at bio input replacements for fertilizer, pesticide, nematodes, anything that farmers might encounter issues with, what they're trying to do is sell via the big ag players to swap out specific chemicals. But the farmer at no point would be concerned about the technology because they would be recommended it knowing that it would be more ethical, better for the planet, better for them potentially as well, and ultimately would make sense financially. So in a sense, as venture investors, we understand acutely the pains and the concerns that farmers have with the concept of tech. What we need to get over is this idea that this is tech for tech's sake, and understand that there is revolutionary technology that sometimes is looking far more broadly at the system to allow farmers to transition seamlessly to improved ways of farming that will make their lives easier and produce better produce.
Really interesting. I love the way that you contextualize that. We're sort of looking back in history at things like the printing press and the loom, and of course, I guess one of the definitions of something which is a really good piece of technology is one where once people start using it, other people start looking in and wonder how on earth somebody didn't invent this, years and years before. And no fence is a great example of that, where it's something now which I think is so embedded as an idea within the regenerative movement that so many different people are seeing different applications for it. It's almost as if it has always been there, and it seems to be something which is, of interest to people, wherever they are in the world and whichever supply chain they're in. So it's a great example of an enabling technology.
And ironically, Finlo, it's the only company that does sell direct to farmers. But it's interesting how, from an awareness and potentially branding perspective, it's a very easy concept for farmers to get their head around exactly how much time and money it can save them instantly. Mm-hmm. So it's fairly unique in that regard. Whereas something like a Miratero, who analyze soil using various types of spectroscopy, is something that is a harder thing for potentially a farmer that has no idea about spectroscopy to get their head around. However, once they can understand what their baseline soil life looks like and be able to ultimately be paid to improve that, then technologies like that will begin to start making a huge difference as well.
I guess one of the importance of technology within the regenerative movement is that when businesses are investing in new technology for whatever kind of agriculture it is, it starts to shine an ever greater spotlight onto that form of agriculture. And of course, within mainstream conventional agriculture, there are so many technologies that exist there. You can't open a farming magazine without being, sold to with these various different technologies. If we just think of the tractor, how many different sorts of tractor are there? So I guess, the question is, once technology and businesses have started to sort of evolve and they are shining that spotlight onto the regenerative agriculture movement, onto the power of regen, unlocking the power of regen, are there many more different versions of no fence? Are there other things out there that you can see coming along the way, which will give more and more companies the opportunity to pivot away from the conventional technology they're investing in now and into these new forms of technology that are enabling this sort of much more holistic approach to food and fiber production?
I mean, this is just briefly, Simon, I'll pass over to you. This is one of the questions that we wrestle with frequently, which is it's great that there's a regenerative groundswell and it's coming bottom up. But the other piece is, for things to move quickly, we need big ag to start shifting elements of their supply chains into being regenerative. And so, in a sense, yes, there'll be technologies like no fence that come along and are instantly very attractive for the farmer, but actually big ag will start selling to farmers without them necessarily making any decision to adopt a new product, simply because they are more ethical, cheaper, better for the planet. And those two pieces need to happen in conjunction.
Did you want to come in on that question, Simon?
Well, it's just to say that there's a potential flywheel that is created. So we're tool making animals. We create technology based upon, our mindset, the context we're in, the cultural, social, economic dynamics we're in. As more and more people shift into this regenerative mindset, not just the farmers, but as Chris is saying, the whole of the supply chain, more innovations that lend themselves towards regeneration will come forward. So we haven't invented technology for regeneration yet, with a few isolated examples. So I'm very confident that that will happen pretty organically, and it is already starting to happen. And of course, it's a push and a pull. I want to get slightly away from agricultural technology because it's one piece of the puzzle. We have to pull regenerative produce through the supply chain. And we have to create incentives and opportunities in the market which compete with the dominance of ultra-processed food and low quality produce on the supermarket shelves. We also need to disrupt the supermarkets fundamentally. And the supply chain is in a bit of a mess. We spend a lot of time with large supply chain investors, and it's riddled with inefficiencies, old infrastructure, risks. It's massively underfunded. So yeah, every element of the food and fiber supply chain needs to be upgraded as regenerative produce comes online, and it also needs to incentivize more production of regenerative food and fiber.
And I guess within this whole sort of tech piece, this tech conversation, we have AI, which is, still this relatively unknown beast. What role do you think that artificial intelligence can play in Regen Ag?
I'm not sure it's the right question. I think the role is what role is it not going to play? Agriculture and food systems, the whole piece from farm to fork is staggeringly complex. There's a huge amount of data involved in decision making. As we know, decision making for farmers is entirely contextual. AI offers the opportunity to bring down the cost of the access of granular information that is actionable across the supply chain, but for farmers as well. And in that sense, it will play a role in every technology that we invest into. At the most basic level, it's going to speed up the pace at which the startups that we fund execute, which will bring down the amount of capital that those companies need to raise, which will have an interesting effect on the investors such as ourselves that do back those companies. Because if the companies are more capital efficient, because they have access to AI tools, that's going to be potentially a very lucrative opportunity for investors that are able to get in early and help those companies grow because they'll get to profitability faster.
I take your point that, of course, AI can help at all stages of the supply chain, and it's a question of working out where it's most useful to have that sort of immediate assistance and where the supply chain, can sort itself out in different ways. But just this last week, John Kempf's new AI system, Delphi, has landed, and I wonder if either of you have had a chance to try that out as yet.
Yeah, I've had a chance to try it out, and Chris and I have met John. He's a lovely man, fascinating polymath. An experienced farmer. We've diligenced several companies that are using AI to train against large data sets, soil data sets in many cases. So at the moment, as you can appreciate with Delphi, is you can put in a question such as, I've got a calcium deficiency in my field that I'm going to be planting with potatoes. Can you help? And it'll spit out, a lot of very useful information, but it's generic, so it might say, well, you should, put down 3,000 pounds of gypsum per acre and use this foliar spray. And we have a bioorganic product, which has some calcium in it that you can use as a foliar spray when the crop comes up, et cetera, et cetera. But if I could be any farmer in the world and be like, oh, but I don't have a device that sticks on my tractor that does that. Or no, that's not going to work because my fields I'm in Jersey and my fields are like this. They're really, really hilly. So it's the context that matters in all of this. So, Delphi is a start, and there's other companies that have started sort of, similar value propositions. How can we help farmers get to a sensible decision based on a very, very complex situation? The reality from what we're seeing is you need a lot more data. You need topographical data, you need soil data, but you also need you need to understand the actual farm business itself. So it almost comes back to the agronomy role. or the land agent role. There's a lot of things to factor into even just one decision, like trying to address a calcium deficiency in a potato crop.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Whenever I've used AI tools, just, Chat GPT or anything like that in the past, I found that it's only obviously as good as the information that it has to draw on. And so when you're working at the vanguard of a particular industry, and in this case it's regenerative agriculture, it's only as good as the information that existed 6 months ago or a year ago. And so often, it can give me some pointers, but it's really not comprehensive. And what was interesting about John's Delphi is that, of course, it has the whole weight of John's mind to draw on, and so it's able to sort of get further in terms of regenerative agriculture. But as you say, it doesn't have the nuance of the specific location, of the specifics of a farm business. What it did seem to be very good at doing was raising other things that I might need to think about. So, for example, I asked it a fairly simple question this morning about ploughing versus glyphosate to produce milling wheat, and it came back with fairly nuanced answers. But what it was inviting me to do was to think about it further. It was giving me other things that I needed to ask questions about. So from that perspective, it was helpful. And I guess it's going to need lots of testing and further development, I'm sure. But it seems that the role of AI is to help us think more clearly, rather than simply giving us an answer in itself. Does that accord with your experience, Simon?
Yes, definitely. I mean, one idea that comes to mind is, there's some excellent regenerative agriculture courses now globally. One that I did was with Richard Perkins, the Regenerative Ag Masterclass. He's got thousands of hours worth of content, which goes into very, very minute detail about different elements of regeneration in a sort of a small scale farming context. I don't think it will be very long before a sort of an AI version of Richard can sit on a farmer's desktop and bring you to the YouTube information, or unlock the information within his library in order to help the farmer in situ try and make a decision, a bit like Delphi. So, yeah, the opportunities here are vast. Executing and monetizing them is an entirely different ballgame. Because, as we know, farmers are tricky fish, and the value proposition needs to be incredibly high here to see traction. As we've seen with Mad Capital and No Fence, the value proposition needs to be right on point for there to be a scalable opportunity.
Fantastic. Let's move on from tech and from AI and onto, these sort of bigger subjects, I suppose. And there's been an incredible amount of focus on carbon over the course of regenerative agriculture's history, cycling, sequestering, measuring, accounting. But it seems to me that now there are lots of conversations homing in on the vital importance of water, and that the conversation's moving from simply being carbon to water as well. Why is water so important, and how does it become an investment opportunity?
Well, it's one of the four ecosystem processes, and carbon is a subset of the mineral cycle. And we are having biodiversity since the Montreal COP has risen up the agenda. So we now have two ecosystem processes which people are talking about and are developing policies around. Water is the third. And the fourth is energy flow, or photosynthetic flow through the biosphere, and through aquatic life as well. So it's one extra level. On the most simple level, it's one extra level of nuance that sort of the policymakers and the regulators and the large corporates and institutional investors are at the very early stages of beginning to think about. But there's a whole, as you've known from some of our previous sorts of conferences and talks, there's many layers to why water is super important.
And how does it become an investment opportunity?
It's an extremely good question. I mean,
so I guess the question is really, why is it relevant to a venture capitalist like yourself, other than the fact that it's an important part of regeneration?
When we experience climate change, so the costs of climate change, the unpredictability, the risks, essentially the mitigation and adaptation challenges that affect everything from insurance companies right through to large food companies, as we know. climate change is a hydrological set of phenomena. It's droughts, floods, wildfires, extreme storms. At a basic physical level, these are driven by water dynamics. So it's the water system that's out of kilter, not just the fact that we have excess greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. It's also true that even if we were to be wildly successful at reducing industrial emissions and drawing down carbon into biosystems through nature-based solutions and Regen Ag specifically, there's quite a bit of scientific literature out there that, do you remember that old experiment we did in school where you'd essentially dissolve a gas within a liquid, and then you'd sort of create a vacuum, and then the gas would come out of the liquid into the void that you'd created? Well, if we reduce carbon emissions really, really successfully, we've got an awful lot of CO2 concentrated within the oceans that's probably going to re-equilibrate. So, we might be making a dent on emissions, but in fact, they're still sort of staying the same. But there's a deeper thing behind water, and there's not enough time to go into it now, but we touched on it in our groundswell presentation and our RFSI presentation, where we were working with Walter Jenne's work and Didi Perhouse's work. At the core of it, water is both fundamentally important in the landscape for the productivity of farming. It's a more important metric, and for farmers, and it's a more important pressing issue with soil compaction, droughts, and then sort of extreme flooding in the wintertime. Farmers can't get crops in when they need to, and crops are drying up and grass is drying up in the summer. That is the critical issue that we need to address, across the UK, across Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean climates, is we're running out of water, and our landscapes are drying up. I know that sounds dramatic, but that's exactly what's going on. So that's the more pressing issue. It's also that when we get water back in the landscape in the way that it used to occur when our landscapes were healthier and when our farming was less degenerative, water is what drives planetary cooling dynamics. It's not the only thing that drives them, but it's a serious part. 95% of latent heat dynamics are governed by water and water vapor. So the way that we address climate change, we think, at Pelican Ag, in the most incisive, cost-effective, and scalable way, is by restoring natural biosystems and prioritizing regenerative agriculture in agricultural landscapes.
I guess what I'm driving at is whether there are particular technologies or particular investment opportunities within the water space, or whether, from your perspective at the moment, there aren't, but there is an understanding, an increasing understanding, that it's critical to regenerative agriculture and making regenerative agriculture function, and therefore people need to understand more about it.
It's quite cheap to measure some metrics around water on farm today. It's not well taught in agricultural colleges. It's time consuming, and the data can be extremely variable and not necessarily particularly useful. So yes, water tech is going to be hugely important. We haven't yet seen a water technology company that has particularly sparked our imagination around the way that we look at regenerative farming, but it will happen.
If I may, Finlo, we I suppose touch the climate LP and the climate VC community fairly closely, and what's been interesting is the shift in thinking over the last few years, where people are beginning to understand how soil health, which, as Simon is alluding to, equals, in a sense, water cycle health, is becoming this great lever. In England, 70% of our land is farmed. We only understand 1% of what's in our soils, but we do understand that by making them healthier, it's carbon itself is hydrophilic, but water will sit in the ground, and whether it's half an acre or a continent, we can begin to restore weather and rain. And so whether we're investing directly into water tech, which at some point we would like to think we will, it's more holistically, if we're investing into increasing the quality of our soils, then we are restoring weather systems. And this is a keystone to climate thinking, is something that we're beginning to see. And if you imagine 3 years ago within the world of food tech particularly, but climate tech also, there was a huge focus on novel food, vertical farming, pieces that didn't necessarily work with nature to try and solve the downstream issue at hand. Direct air carbon capture might be another good example. Understanding the importance of soil within that system is now becoming far more mainstream, and that is part of the excitement, because the really progressive investors whom would categorize themselves as climate VCs or LPs are now very much on this bandwagon. And so what does that mean for this deluge of fantastic companies and founders that we're speaking to who are riding this wave of new science? Well, despite the fact that we're in a market downturn, their ability to start taking significant market share in whatever realm of the farming world that they operate in is pronounced. And our aim is to really make sure that we cherry pick the ones that are going to make the largest difference within a time frame that makes sense, and try and provide them with the oxygen that they need.
Let's stick with soil health and its role sort of higher up the supply chain as well, and the impact that it has on the supply chain higher up. I know that you have a personal interest in nutrition, that's something that's really important to you. Why is soil health critical to human health?
Well, I suppose it's interesting, the awareness piece at the moment around nutrition. We've got Henry Dimbleby's Ravenous, which was his food strategy put into a consumable form, becoming a bestseller. We've got Ultra Processed People by Chris Van Tullochen, really turning heads in terms of what food as medicine or food as poison can do to the human body. I suppose the next step is very much understanding that fresh produce, veg, fruit, meat, nuts, seeds are not all equal. It's the how, not the cow, is the phrase that's often used for beef production. So when we study nutrition and the nutritional profiling within, let's say, red meat, and we look at the swings in omega-6 to 3s, and industrialized beef is very heavy in omega-6s, which in excess is not a fantastic thing for the human body. It's a sort of all-cause mortality effector. All roads lead back to a more regenerative form of farming. So what's interesting, and maybe this goes back to your AI point previously, is that we didn't have a huge amount of data on soil and how it functions over the course of a day, a week, a month, a season, how it functions within its various different communities with its various different crops over those times. So the amount of variables are enormous. Now, the idea that we can begin to sample and create the data that will ultimately link to the nutritional profiling of that produce, and then how that particular piece of produce, whether it's a fruit or a piece of meat, then bioassimilates into the human system. So firstly within the gut, but then through the various biological processes that we use for different types of nutrition into our bodies on a human by human basis is an unfathomable amount of information to get one's head around. And there are beginning to be companies who are isolating sections of this to really try and push corporates to understand how bad their food really is, or how impossible to assimilate any of the positive parts of the food that they're producing is, and get them to therefore process, package, ship, but also ideally push their farmers. It's not a phrase I'd like to use, but encourage their farmers and show their farmers and potentially pay their farmers to farm in ways that are more agroecological. And this is a world that Eve Balfour in the 30s started pushing in a way that was years ahead of her time. The health of the people and the planet, of the soil and the world's people, are one indivisible whole. Really, It was understanding the delicacy of how we have evolved as human beings with the healthy soils that pervaded this planet before industrialized farming to provide the full spectrum of nutrients that our bodies need. Some of them trace elements for trace processes, for pieces that we might, as human beings, use very infrequently over the course of the year, but are fundamental to our longevity. And within all of that is a huge amount of technology that we're trying to pick the best of.
And within that, I suppose, I wonder how better nutrition becomes an opportunity for Regen Ag investors like yourselves.
Sorry, Finlay, did you say you wonder how Regen Ag becomes an opportunity?
No, how nutrition,
Sorry,
how better nutrition.
I was about to say.
I'll ask it again.
Yeah.
So how does better nutrition become an opportunity for Regen Ag investors like yourselves?
Yeah, so this is a good question, and it's going to be a frontier that will hopefully proliferate over the next few years as the data and science grows. But it's definitely a frontier, and it's thinner on the number of companies that we can look at than other sectors, say soil measurement. We backed a company called Edacious earlier on in the year, whom are a nutritional analysis platform, beginning with red meat, moving into dairy, and then pulses and certain vegetables and grains. All roads, as discussed, lead back to more regenerative practices. But they're interesting in that they work alongside large corporates whose supply chains are perhaps harder to shift and whose products may be, frankly, generally not brilliant for human consumption, versus new, younger companies who are getting things very right. And the more information that can then become available to both the consumer, but also to any kind of regulatory frameworks that will eventually be set up to shift the taxation systems within food and how food is supplied, especially to low income communities who may live in food deserts where it's simply impossible to be able to go and buy fresh produce at a price that makes sense, let alone know necessarily how to cook and make it taste good, to get their children to eat it, etc. Are hugely complex, nuanced issues. And whether it's food tokens, which is a big suggestion at the moment, taxing fast food, creating food hubs. There is a long way to go within all of this, and technology will certainly play a role. Simon, it might be worth touching on something like Ubi and what they will do to a food system.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. So another thing that's happening within the food supply chain is the emergence of disruptive local food supply chain platforms. And there's a company scaling in Europe called Crowd Farming. There's a company here that we know intimately well. I'm a small investor in, used to be an advisor to, called Ubi. In these models, broadly speaking, farmers are aggregating produce at a local level, a smaller scale, and then distributing it at a local level as well. Or at least that's the first iteration. It's analogous to the technological next step to the farmers market, if you like. What do you do if you have 8 or 10 farmers pooling produce and then selling it to the 10, 15,000 people that live locally? What these models are showing is a complete inversion of the economics of traditional industrial farming, where the farmer, in the case of dairy, or in producing wheat, you're making, pennies on the pound. The farmers that are selling on these platforms are clipping 50, 60, 70, 80% of the gross profit margin, which is exactly where we need to be. Now, of course, it comes with trade-offs, because now the farmers are expected to be not just more entrepreneurial and savvy in marketing, but just the labor involved, the sheer amount of work involved in collecting small amounts of your produce and selling it for basket sizes like the supermarket locally. But that's where these platform technologies come in, because they're taking a lot of that heavy lifting off the farmer. And at the very least, what what these businesses that are growing so fast are demonstrating is that there is a real appetite within the farming community to at least diversify some of their revenue base. So to not have all of their eggs in one basket, to not have it all in the Tesco contract or whatever, which is very encouraging.
I know you're also interested in resilience, Simon, and it's a word that comes up more and more at the moment. So it's being recognized more and more frequently as something that's critically important. The resilience of the food system and conversely, the fragility of the food system. In terms of food security, I wonder what that term means to you. And it's a big question, but how can targeted venture capital investment help to address these challenges, help society to become more resilient and food secure?
Well, I'll hand over to Chris because he's delved into this subject quite a lot. All I would say, and this is a bit dramatic, is as we saw with COVID, as we saw with the big drought, I think in 2022, all it's going to take is another big heat wave, whether it's in Southern California or whether it's in the Mediterranean, or a computer outage in some very, very important system that runs produce traveling on ships around the world. We are sailing very close to the wind of serious food shortages, and these risks are going to increase dramatically as climate weather extremes increase as well. Chris?
It's amazing how little it's being mentioned in the press. I mean, whether it was the flooding in Valencia or the wildfires in LA or even the flooding in Germany 2 years ago, the soil's not holding that water in the landscape, and the reasons for that, i.e. they've been denuded, is what makes this space so exciting for us in one sense, and that's beginning to become more mainstream as an understanding solution to all of this. And so in a roundabout way, in terms of resilience and food security, I mean, on the one hand, 80% of the world's commodities pass through 5 major ports, all of which have some form of unique pressure on them, whether it's terrorism, whether it's the war in Ukraine. And so that, with an understanding that as the natural shocks within the world's ecosystems are increasing on an annual basis and countries are beginning to look to onshore, it's creating a huge amount of opportunity. There are, however, enormous factors in the way that are not always ideal for this, and some of those are looking at the food system itself and understanding that whichever part of it you look at, there are often a monopoly of 3 or 4 players that really own that niche, whether it's the ownership of seeds or meat production or the brands themselves. And perhaps in the UK, for instance, we don't suffer as much from branded meat, as an example, whereas in America, if you go to a fridge full of bacon, there will be perhaps 20 brands, but only 3 or 4 owners of the majority of those. So what does onshoring look like? How can we begin to create marketplaces that are meaningful and are backed in a manner that they can proliferate quick enough to actually convince consumers to shift towards using those? Are all questions that we're very keen to. There are founders solving them at the moment in ways that we're hugely excited by. And the UK government, for instance, were looking at the Danish government, who a couple of years ago managed to shift 70% of their publicly procured food to becoming organic within a 6-month period. So they set up the supply chains to make that happen very quickly. Now, I'm quite quick to say that it's a big number, and people are quick to put more onus on what publicly procured food actually means, i.e. it's still a single-digit percentage within the UK, so it's not massive. But the idea that, in this case, it was the City of London with Sadiq Khan, we're working with the Food and Farming Commission to try and work out how to implement a shift like that quickly. It's a cultural piece as much as a practical piece. It's being pushed by government in ways that might be fairly blunt at the moment, but will become more sophisticated. The Brits have been pretty good with things like the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Carbon Code, which have become potentially exportable global standards. What happens within nutrition is yet to be seen, and particularly in terms of food resilience, likewise. But as long as there can be some funding freed up for the various departments to really get stuck in on this, there will be some top-down funding that will be useful. But I believe that the corporates, old and new, will be where the real pace comes from.
Just quickly on this, policymakers still seem to see food security primarily in terms of volume and of price, in many cases completely missing the bigger picture that we've been discussing around the role of soil health and nutrition and water and so on. Do you think that investment can help to nudge that perception at government level, particularly at Treasury or Finance Minister level?
There are some brilliant people within each piece of government, within each department. Getting a voice heard outside of being ruined by consensus often is pretty tough. And we work closely with George Eustace, who was seminal to setting up the environmental land management schemes and working with the various government departments, particularly with Treasury, to try and free up funding for DEFRA to be able to move as freely and as progressively as they might like. And although we're making great steps, we cannot rely. And I think waiting for policy is a fool's errand. We need to have business models that are existing now to be able to move the needle, with an expectation that government will then come on side.
And just before we finish, we need to touch on natural capital and blended finance. What do you think is most exciting in this space, Christopher?
The good news is that considering we're in a downturn, which means that PE venture capital tends to suffer, despite the fact that the best vintages of venture funds have all come from economic downturns, we have managed to see some of the natural capital investors really put their money where their mouth is within the UK. And again, I would argue that the UK has an opportunity to really be considered a leader within this space. The nuance around regeneration and regenerative farming is being done in other parts of the world as well. There's some fantastic funds in Australia and America, like Impact Ag and SLM, whom we know well and have learned and are learning a huge amount from fairly continuously. The good news is that the UK investors have begun to pull together a coterie of larger institutions who seem to be getting more and more confident with this nascent space. And Nattergal might be a good example. Oxygen, Regenerate Outcomes. There's a bunch of people doing it. What we need to happen is see some successes soon, and perhaps to elocute those to the broader financial community better, such that we can increase the size of this tent within the LP community meaningfully during a time that is tricky.
Simon, I wonder if you can just round us out. The big Regen Ag challenge is to scale at pace while maintaining land use and nutritional integrity. What's making you most hopeful right now?
Well, this is going to be a bit of a weird way of saying it. I don't think there's too much lemon from the degenerative food system that we can. I don't think there's too much juice left in that lemon to squeeze. Yields have plateaued, inputs have skyrocketed, soils are drying up. Farmers are, many of them are on their knees, or very much feel that their backs are against the wall, not helped by Labour's recent policies. Human ingenuity is forged in challenge and difficulty. So with each challenge, you were talking about resilience earlier and essentially redundancy. We have no redundancy in the system. So something's going to crack, and then the politicians will be talking about it, and they'll be talking about it as if they actually knew what they were talking about beforehand, which will be deeply frustrating. But there you go. There's not much road left for big ag and industrial food systems. at every level of analysis, it's a system that's highly fragile. I mean, I can't imagine a healthcare system 15 years from now where we're even more unhealthy, and where we're consuming even more ultra-processed food, and reliant upon pharmaceutical drugs that don't actually address the root cause of the issue. So the opportunity for regenerative food systems is just going to become more pressing as the months and the years roll by. And that is the great arbitrage opportunity of investors such as ourselves. Our mission is to crowd in capital into this space, not just into our fund, but into the movement generally, because the opportunities are just vast. And to be honest, we owe it to our children to create a better future.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. That's all we've got time for. I'd like to thank my guests, Simon Evill and Christopher Ramsay from Pelican Ag. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. And please do check out our Farmgate Leaders and Filling the Funding Gap series by scrolling back in your podcast feeds. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the USC Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now.